All right, so this lecture covers reading and summarizing research articles. So some general tips for reading research. Read slowly. It takes time to read articles kind of thoroughly and understand, so don't necessarily expect to skim through, although you may find articles that, just the introduction is useful for you. And so you may skim the rest of the article but not read it in detail, and that's okay. But if you find a really high quality article, you're going to want to read it slowly to make sure that you really understand it. You need to take notes, especially with kind of a long-term paper like this. You're not going to remember, several weeks, much less several months later. So make sure you're taking notes. There's a lot of evidence that taking notes is going to help you remember better than highlighting, and it's going to help you organize the information that you get from the article much better than highlighting. So you really need to be taking notes while you're reading, and you need to organize your notes by source. We talked about how important that is to avoid plagiarism, and we'll talk about some strategies today about how to organize your ideas. Okay, so the abstract you'll see in most empirical articles, it's a brief summary of the article. It won't give you all the information, but as you're searching for articles, this is a good place to kind of get a hint. Is this going to be useful for me in any way? The introduction addresses a number of topics. So what's the general topic of research? What have other researchers already discovered about this topic? So it's going to include a review of literature, kind of the current state of the knowledge, what's new about this study compared to other research, and what are the researchers' hypotheses. So this is a really important part to kind of get an idea of what the study is about, but also if you're just getting into it, the introduction of articles can be a good place to find other relevant research and give you a sense of kind of some basic definitions and what we know about the area. Okay, so the method should be a very thorough summary of what the researchers did. It should enable you to kind of envision what was actually done. So it should include things like what are the characteristics of the participants, what apparatus or materials or questionnaires were used for the study, and what's the procedure, what did the participants actually do. The results are often the most difficult to read if you don't have a statistical background, but you should be able to get out of it for each hypothesis, what results did the results support the hypothesis? So you should be able to identify that. At a more advanced level, what statistical tests did the researcher use when they analyzed the data? Less worried about that for you, but in everyday English, what do the statistical tests tell you? Are the results consistent with other research? And so sometimes it's easy to get kind of hung up on the details of the stats when you're reading an article, but remember that kind of what you need to know is, did the results support the hypotheses, or what did they find? Sometimes it's okay to kind of skim the results and understand them as best you can, because they should be restating the results in the discussion. Another important component of the results is the tables and figures. Don't just skip them, especially the figures. Take the time to look at them and kind of dissect them, because it might help you understand the results even if you don't understand the text. Reading the results in small chunks, one paragraph at a time, and kind of making sure you understand that paragraph before you move to the next can also help you. So this is just an example of a figure that might help you interpret some results. So this is a study where they viewed humorous pictures and recorded the amount of mirth, which was smiling and laughing. And in this study, they manipulated an independent variable of cohesiveness, where they had groups that were cohesive or uncohesive, and they also recorded whether participants were male or female. And so you can tell that they saw these group differences where the cohesive groups laughed more than the uncohesive groups. But there's also some gender differences here where it looked like the women laughed more than the men. But with a graph, the y-axis is almost always the dependent variable. So that tells you what their outcome is, and the x-axis and the key can tell you what was manipulated. So these are key things that you can identify just looking at a graph. Okay, in terms of the discussion, again, they should start by summarizing the results again. So if the results section kind of went completely over your head, then you can look in the discussion and see if they reiterate the results so that you can really digest them. They'll talk about whether the present research findings agree with the previous research and with accepted theory. They'll talk about if there were any unexpected findings and why they think they occurred. They'll talk about why the researchers think their findings are important and what are the implications of this research. What does this suggest? And then finally, the references. We've talked about how to make a references list, but as you're reading articles, a references list is really useful to track down research that you didn't already know about. So again, if you find one article that seems awesome, look at their references list and see who they cited. Okay, so in terms of what to take notes on, there's a number of things that you want to look at. Identifying the article's main topic and research questions, some key points to their methodology, right? If you're looking at something with children, you want to identify what age they looked at. Was it an experimental or a correlational study? What measures did they use? Again, depending on your topic, these things will be more or less important, but these are often key. The thesis, or more importantly, the conclusions and recommendations. In your literature review, you're not going to be spending a ton of time going into the details of the methodology of an article. You may cover it kind of briefly, but more importantly, you want to talk about kind of what their conclusions were. What relationships did they find between the variables? So you need to make sure that you have that in notes. You also probably want to take notes on how useful the article is for your research, right? So you might just use an article to look at their references and find other sources. You might ignore part of the study that's not relevant and just look at one aspect. Or maybe the introduction is really helpful to give you definitions, but the actual study isn't really relevant. Nothing is obligating you to use the entire study in your paper. So taking notes on how you think it will help you is going to be important. Also, any specific definitions or key ideas, if you're going to do these and put them in quotes, record specific page numbers, but remember, use these sparingly. Most of your notes should be paraphrasing. Okay, so we'll talk about a couple of different strategies. The two that I recommend are using an Excel file or an annotated bibliography, but the Excel file is what I use when I'm writing. And so basically what an Excel file enables you to do is keep track of research and keep track of references and identify key points from each section of the articles. Okay, so if you have an Excel file, each row is going to be one article and each column is an important piece of information from that article. So you may have a column for the APA style references, a column for introduction, method, results, discussion, and then a column for the relevance of the topic. So this is an example of summaries that I've actually used. This is from my dissertation many years ago now, but I've got the references, I've got my notes from the introduction. Here I have a couple of things about the methodology. I was studying kids, so the participant's age was really important. I've got the measures that they used because that was relevant. The results, and again, make sure that you are not using direct quotes. Make sure you're just summarizing the key points and paraphrasing. The discussion, what's the main point, and then the thoughts are really for me. That's the usefulness. How am I going to use this in my paper? Did this article suck? Was it terrible? Is this awesome? Is this piece of this article really useful? Use that to your advantage so that you have that information. Another strategy is doing an annotated bibliography. And so here you're going to have an APA style reference and then a 3 to 4 sentence paragraph that summarizes it. Again, you should be paraphrasing, so do not copying and paste the abstract. That's not going to be useful for you. You need to put it in your own words. You should include the questions that are addressed in the article, generally the methodology, conclusions, and recommendation. And then you should also include a comment, again, about the usefulness for your research goals. How are you going to use this in your paper? You might include definitions or key terms or things like that. So here's an example of an annotated bibliography. You can see their summary. You can see they pulled a direct quote that they thought might be useful, and they have the page number here. And then they have their comment about the strengths or weaknesses of the article. And then finally, they've got index cards. This is something that's really recommended in your textbook. It can be a lot of paper, and I find it can be kind of cumbersome. So I would recommend you use one of the digital methods. And I'm going to ask you to use the digital method instead. But some people really like using note cards, especially if you have a bunch of different sources. It could potentially kind of help you visualize information. And you have to make sure if you're going to use note cards that you have the reference on every single card. Otherwise, you could end up with information that you don't know where it came from. But generally what you would do, 1 point or thought per card. It helps you organize arguments and synthesize similar information from different sources. But we have some strategies that we're going to do later in the semester to try to help you with that as well. Okay, so this is what it might look like. There won't be a verse, but you've got the author's last name and the page number. I would recommend using the author's last name and year unless you've got a direct quote. But the page number is kind of useful because even if you don't include it in the paper, you know where to look back at it. Okay. And then finally, this is just kind of a summary. This was mostly on the slides, but this is a summary of the kinds of questions you should be able to answer about each of the different sections of an article to make sure that you really understood it. So those are the things to look at as you're reading an article.